want to talk a little bit about some of the abolitionist movements here in Mexico?
Well, there were several people that were very instrumental in furthering the cause of abolitionism. And sometimes people got their information by going to church and listening to what the pastor said, because there was no other means of information other than Starr Clark's newspaper. And if you agreed with the pastor on abolitionism, that was good. Sometimes they did not agree with the pastor, and we have a document here. Starr Clark for many years belonged to the Presbyterian Church, and we are quite certain that there was a difference of opinion with the pastor, and he stopped going to the Presbyterian Church and became a Methodist. and there were a lot of social gatherings at churches, and it was discussed there. There were several very well-known abolitionists that lived here in Mexico. It was considered a hotbed of abolitionism, and some of them went about the country speaking on how bad it was for the poor slaves and how they should be freed. We have pictures down here of several well-known abolitionists that lived here. They were really very well known across the Northeast.
One of them was Asa Wing in the top frame. Asa Wing lived out on what's now Route 69 near Colossus. His house is shown on that poster as well. Asa Wing was an abolitionist speaker. He went around the Northeast, actually, New England and New York State, and tried to convince those in attendance at his speeches that freeing the slaves was the right thing to do. He died young, probably from throat cancer. He was 38 when he died, and Frederick Douglass spoke at his funeral down here in the Mexico Cemetery. Frederick Douglass, of course, most of you know. His speaking prowess was so great that he drew about 3,000 people into the village of Mexico for Asa Wing's funeral. And of course, it was a hot August day, and there were about 1,000 carriages and horses. And it's hard to imagine how the village must have smelled during that speech. The speech lasted well over an hour. We have the transcript of it, and the transcript of a poem that was also read at the ceremony. Another abolitionist speaker from Mexico was James Caleb Jackson. He became famous for a number of things, but his speaking prowess, again, was extraordinary, and he converted an awful lot of people to follow the abolitionist cause. He was the inventor of granula. He called it granula, and when Kellogg's decided to sell it commercially, they called it granola. But he was the inventor of the first dry cereal.
Garrett Smith was a very well-known abolitionist, and he made a fortune in selling real estate, and that helped fund many of the abolitionist activities in this area. He owned the east side harbor of Oswego, and that's where the Canadian ships came in and were able to transport slaves to Canada where they would be free. And one famous fugitive who was transported through there was William Jerry Henry, and that was the Jerry Rescue. Jerry Henry was indeed a runaway slave. And when 1850, the Fugitive Slave Law was passed, it allowed the slave catchers to come north and retrieve the runaway slaves and return them to their rightful owners. And Jerry Henry was working in Syracuse as a cooper, made barrels, salt barrels. And the slave catcher came to his place of business and captured him with the aid of the police. At the very same time, the Liberty Party, which was an abolitionist party, was having a convention in Syracuse. And when they heard about Jerry being captured, they ran out of the convention site, tussled with the police, tried to free Jerry. The police won, and Jerry was put into jail awaiting trial the next day by a magistrate who would decide if he was free or if he was a slave. The Liberty Party people managed to get a group together, and the next day they came with a battering ram and battered down the door to the jail and freed Jerry. He was hidden in different houses in Syracuse for 4 different days, and then a butcher who had a store in downtown Syracuse came north with his wagon with a canvas cover over it. And he attracted the attention of the police, who gave chase. And Jerry and the butcher ended up in Mexico. And the first night he stayed in a little house across from the high school. And then the second night they moved him out to a farm on the outside of the village, where he stayed for 2 weeks. They were able to arrange passage for him to Canada in a Canadian ship. And indeed, he lived 2.5 years in Canada. And we found a picture of a chair that Jerry had made. He worked as a carpenter in Kingston, and he died. He died of pneumonia. The climate did not agree with him very well, and he's buried in the Cataraqui Cemetery in Kingston. This made every newspaper almost in the country, and it proved to the slave catchers, don't come to this area because you will get no cooperation. Some of the runaway slaves who came through upstate New York were safely guided by people who were cooperating with the abolitionists. The manacles that Jerry wore, these are not Jerry's manacles, but they are in Syracuse at their historical museum, and they look just like those.